Shooting it raw?
Yes, shooting it raw.
My husband's passion is driving classic cars in classic car races. And I found it very scary looking at the start of races, because that is the moment, the start to the getting through the first corner is the moment when accidents are more likely to happen. Everyone's already bunched up. People start all together. The first corner is always tricky. I found that if I was behind a camera and looking at things through a lens, it took away some of the emotion and I could walk through the camera lens. It was a way of distancing myself and objectifying what I was looking at.
Thank you very much, Lady Chisholm, for joining me on Shooting It Raw. It's a great honor. I'm very, very pleased. And we will get to know you through the photographs that you sent over. Right now, you are based in London.
Just outside, yeah.
Right.
Just outside, in the suburbs. Deepest, darkest suburbia.
Well, good morning to you.
And good evening to you.
Thank you very much. Okay, so let's just dive right in. I'm looking right now at the photograph, which is essentially the first image is, it looks like a sunset. There's the water. It's a funny image because on the one hand, there's the water from the ocean or a sea and the surf and the waves. And then there seems to be a pool that is just a few, like 1 meter or so above the level of the water. And I can imagine that when the surf is high, the water gets into the pool because people are swimming. So why is this the first image that you're using to frame this conversation?
I couldn't be happier that you looked at the photo and saw what you saw and expressed that. I was wondering how to weave the conversation around that, and you've given it to me on the plate.
This ain't my first rodeo.
First of all, it is not the sunset.
Okay.
But I'm very pleased you saw it as a sunset, because that was my goal in having this photograph. Depending on who you are, where you are, what your experiences are, especially if you have never been to that particular place, you can see it perfectly as a sunset or a sunrise.
Okay.
It happened to be a sunrise.
The light is quite interesting.
But it needn't be. So that is how you see it is about you, not about the photo.
Right.
That's one. And you could say that it's about your knowledge of where that photo has been taken. If you know that that is Bronte Beach in Sydney, Australia, then it explains that's the Southern Ocean, that is a sunrise.
Right.
And that is the Bronte Pool. And in Australia, many of the eastern beaches, at least, many of the beaches have these ocean pools.
It's amazing.
That are filled by seawater. That's
amazing.
And it's beautiful.
Yeah.
Perhaps the most famous one is Bondi Beach.
Right.
Bondi's is higher than Bronte's. And if you know Bronte, that picture would just say Bronte.
Of course. Well, okay, so I think I need to kind of explain, sort of at least give the visual cues because people are listening. So 1/3 of the image is a kind of classic composed of the skies at the top third. And the light is quite interesting because it could very well be a sunset, could very well be a sunrise. It's kind of a little bit in between in terms of the color, the reproduction, and the exposure. I've been to Bondi Beach, so I kind of know what you mean by the architecture leading down to the water, and there's just surf, and the surf comes very much, and I love it, and so looking at this image, so the bottom 2/3 of the image is basically the open water, and then there's like a semicircle, half circle where there is clearly a pool and people are swimming. it's a bit in silhouette, so it's you're not really sure what you're looking at, and you could see some of the hints of the light off the surf at the bottom of the image. And here is what I like about the beginning of this conversation, and the fact that of how you framed the conversation. I understand that you're decoding images, and you're looking at the image as more than just a representation or a kind of photojournalistic capture of a time and a place. It's a signifier to something very intellectual. And so therefore, let's open that door, that philosophical door of what is going on intellectually in your mind when you're asking me to interpret what I see.
For me, it opens the door to beginning to walking through into a room which enables you to recognize that what is out there is different for everyone.
Okay.
Up to a point.
Sure.
There's a wonderful phrase by a wonderful British academic called Chris Frith. And what he says is perception is a fantasy that coincides with reality. And just in this case, it's about experience and knowledge. I have the knowledge. I took the photograph, but I needn't have. If I'd seen it, I've seen paintings of that spot. I've seen other photographs. I've been swimming there in the ocean, not in the pool. So I have the experience and the knowledge from that experience to say, that's Bronte. Or if not Bronte, it is a beach in Australia that's just like Bronte.
Right. Okay.
At dawn. That's not because I'm intelligent, particularly. It's because I happen to have been there. It's not because I've got visual acuity. It's not a test for anyone else, a real test. Because, as you said, there's a certain bit of ambiguity to it. It was made a bit darker than reality as the sun came up, because I took the photograph straight into the sun. So there's a certain amount of ambiguity there. And you can resolve that ambiguity with sufficient experience and knowledge. But that's not always the case with everything that comes into us as human beings through all of our senses, through our body.
Right.
And I guess that was the point I was trying to make. That was the crack of the door.
Right.
That, because you asked me, where's my brain at the moment?
Sure.
And these are the kind of issues that I hope will bring you along and the people who are listening to understanding not where I am, because it's very shifting sands, but why I'm asking questions and what I want to find out, because I'm not there yet. Right.
Well, one of the things that so we don't know each other very well. We've known each other kind of not superficially, but we're just kind of getting to know each other, I guess, professionally. One of the things that I learned just last week, I guess, was that you're starting your PhD.
Yep.
What do you have a thesis already laid out, or how far along? Like, describe your PhD for a second.
I didn't particularly want to do a PhD because it's a long and lonely journey.
It's a serious commitment.
And but I was doing a lot of reading round some questions and talking to people about them and boring people witless about them. And the questions are all around what needs to happen in your body and your brain in order for me to change an established behavior, whether that's a mental behavior, pattern of thought, a habit, or a physical behavior. The most common example people use is how can I eat less so I lose weight, for example? That kind of deep-rooted behavior, or behavior of thought. How can I lose my prejudice against people who chew gum with their mouth open?
Excellent.
For example. Okay? Do they never look at themselves in the mirror? Or are they just abstracted? And that's a bias. That's a personal bias. It's an acquired bias. And the reason I got there was because my work had been, since about 2010, had been in coaching and training and development, particularly to help organizations develop initially their women to their full potential and enable women to achieve higher positions than they were achieving. I had seen in my own career a lot of really bright, able, talented, eager, ambitious young women simply overlooked, like they were invisible, or if not overlooked, underestimated. And I wanted to kind of move the dial. And that work extended not just to women, but to other minorities, to people who were able but overlooked for various reasons. So I got into bias and trying to help bias. And why was it that, in spite of so many people knowing, there was a wonderful, again, speech by Christine Lagarde on
for the IMF, right?
Yeah, when she took over. And she said, the simplest, the lowest hanging fruit to galvanize global economy was to get more women involved in economic activity. So it's so simple. Everybody knows it. The data are there.
So what are the barriers? Yes.
So why isn't it happening? Equally, there had been a lot of evidence, primarily from McKinsey, who had been gathering data for years to say, look, here's the data. If you have a more diverse board, cognitively diverse, ethnically diverse, not just in looks, but in people's experiences, their angles, their point of view, everything. Board, senior management team, and indeed workforce, your innovation goes up.
Right.
But even more importantly, the money you make, your monetization of innovation goes up. Hoy, why isn't it happening?
Right.
Why are people still closing their borders to immigrants?
Right.
When they should be saying, oh my God, come, we want you, our economy will benefit. So there were some big questions, and I was working at a tiny little bit of it at the coalface and thinking, oh gosh, yeah, I can give them the data and do this and do that, it's going to work. And it didn't quite pan out like that.
So many questions just popped up. As you know, I've been working with Po Cheng, and my question to you is, so Po and I have really spent a long time looking, because Po is fascinated in this, and he has the incredible experience in leadership, right? With a big capital L, and especially when looking at international global networks. So did you two meet from within that sphere, or was it because I kind of knew that you've done a lot of interesting work in coaching and personal, like a professional development, especially to help women and minorities. But now, is that the capacity in which you met Po, or did you meet him from something else?
Well, because I was grappling with this issue of why things weren't moving, I started to look at some of the whys, and some of the whys were to do with the very nature of human beings, how their brains and bodies work. And we met because I had started doing some work I did a master's at Henley Management College, and was introduced to neuroscience.
Mm-hmm.
And so I started delving into some of the, if you look, like neurobiological underpinnings of behavior. It's a little bit like wave-particle duality.
Right.
I can understand it up to a point, but I'm not a neuroscientist.
Mm-hmm.
But I have done a lot of reading in that subject. And so what I was doing was presenting to a group of leaders some of my conclusions about how the brain and body work together that have an impact on leadership.
Oh, okay.
And in fact, I've written a book, co-written a book with two colleagues on neuroscience for leadership.
Well, that's the title? What's the title? Promote your book.
It's called, it's called Neuroscience for Leadership.
Ah, perfect. Great.
So that's how I met Po. I was doing a presentation on the brain and the body, and what I was featuring on, and why I knew he was great by the end of the presentation, what I was featuring on was the incredible complexity of how the brain and body work together. And this is biology. It's not engineering or physics. It is the butterfly batting its wing in Hong Kong and things happening around the world. It is as complicated as quantum mechanics, and more so.
Sure.
We're just at the threshold of beginning to find some pointers, not necessarily absolutes, but pointers in some directions about how the brain works. And this business of perception, my perception and your perception are different.
Of course,
We're different people. We've grown up in different places. We have different experience. What I see and feel, even if it's a piece of furniture, I can describe the table, its measurements, but what I feel about that piece of furniture, what it means to me, is completely different. And trying to get people to understand, A, that difference exists, and B, what it might mean in terms of how people see each other, and in a business context, each other's ideas and intervention.
I have to say, I'm eating this up. I love what you're saying.
And how do we bring that difference, that complex difference, to bear on decision making? How do we help? How can we help people take better decisions, both as individuals, but also in groups and organizations? How do we help teachers enable learners to grasp and use some of this complexity? Because after all, it's all about utility. What the brain is there to do is preserve the body through challenging environments in a way that gets you through to the other side in as good a condition as possible.
That's a very nice way of putting survival.
Yes, but not just survival. Survival fit enough not only to reproduce, and at our level as humans, to look after your young for long enough so that they can be fit enough to reproduce. And in order to achieve that, you have to be fit and well. Your brain needs to be able to predict as much as possible your environment so that you can manipulate it and walk through it in a way that keeps you fit and keeps you active in a way that keeps you well.
Sure.
So you've got to eat right and drink enough and all the rest of it. So if you want to go to the next image, this could be a good moment.
Well done. Perfect segue. So the next image is the one titled "Knowledge is Not Enough." Yes?
Yep.
Okay, so do you want to describe it? I mean, essentially, it's not a photograph. It's an illustration, a schematic, a diagram.
It is. It's actually a photograph.
Oh, it is?
It's a photograph of a card that I use quite often when I'm doing a training session.
Okay.
So the photograph is mine. And what it is a ruler on which a line has been drawn, and many people will have seen it. It's a visual illusion. And it's got arrows which are pointing in different directions at different points of the line. And if you can see the image, you can see that those arrows create the illusion.
Mm-hmm.
They create the illusion that where they break into the line, one part of the line is bigger than the other. Now that illusion persists, even if you know that actually the two lines, and you can see that because they're sitting on a ruler, are exactly the same length.
Mm-hmm. That's really interesting.
You know with absolute certainty, this is mathematical certainty.
Yeah.
You know, you have measured it yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Those two parts of that line are exactly the same length. But can you, the you that is the executive part of your brain, tell yourself not to see them as different?
Right.
Can you train yourself not to see them as different? Now, some people say they can. Most people can't.
Mm-hmm.
In this particular visual illusion, there are some visual illusions you can flip, indeed. But that's why knowledge is not enough.
Right.
There are some things which are there because, if you remember, you have got to navigate your environment safely. And not only safely, efficiently and well.
Mm-hmm.
Not use too many of your resources. So, hey, what's this? It's perspective. If you don't see the world with perspective, you are going to keep on falling off stairs, walking into a wall, thinking that it's going to take you 2 seconds to reach someone when it's not.
So I have a question in terms of, okay, so let's take, here's this excellent illusion. And as you say, so essentially it's a photograph of a ruler, and drawn onto that image or whatever, or is as you said, it's you can see that mathematically the ruler, the section on the left is 3 inches and the section on the right is 3 inches. But because of what's been drawn in terms of the arrows, and because of how your eyes perceive, it's purely visually, you can try to see the image from some kind of vantage point so that, as you say, maybe you can somehow read it differently. But fundamentally, your eyes, the information your brain and the conclusion your brain is doing and the knowledge you have, you have the confusion or the mental cognitive dissonance that it still seems smaller. Like the one on the right, because of the arrow sort of shapes, seems smaller than the one on the left. Okay. So that's a great example. So it's
a metaphor.
Yeah, it's a metaphor. So let's just take that into an example. You don't have to get into specifics, but I find it interesting precisely because I've been working in leadership training and coaching and all this stuff. So in terms of your coaching, like have people's brains changed over the time that you've been working as a coach and as a mentor and as a trainer to see that dial moving at all? Or is it is the mindset that you're facing now pretty much the same that it was 2 decades ago, where some women who on paper look like they should be killing it are actually still not quite breaking through?
That's a really good question. What the data that we've been able to gather tells us, particularly on gender equality, is yes, there has been some movement, but it's not always sustained, and it's patchy.
Okay.
And it's nowhere near as far and as fast as you might want it to be, I guess, rather than expect. So the answer is yes, there's been change, but it's slow, it's patchy. In some places it's not sustainable, and it's not going as fast as would make a significant difference to the global economy in the next few years when we might need it, especially because of COVID-19.
Okay.
And if you again, I mean, some of this is my speculation, but if you think about it in terms of evolution, there are certain things that our brains and bodies have learnt to do together because they have enabled us to survive. And one of those is hugely about us and them.
Right. Okay.
and the suspicions that whoever we are, however we define ourselves, and we define ourselves as we in a number of different ways. I mean, we can be my football team, it can be my nationality, it can be where I live, it can be the fact that I went to a particular school or college, it can be my family, it can be people who look like me, and that's quite a broad church, I might say. I'm usually, I'm never asked for my voice, where I'm from. But when people look at me, they say, "Oh, are you Indian? Are you Turkish? Are you Jewish? Are you Italian? Are you Spanish? Are you Indian? Are you Pakistani? Are you?" So there are different ways of being we, and there are equally different ways of being them. There was an absolute classic example today, I gather, in the US with Biden and Trump, and you have tribes. And all of that really, really worked. You know, people who got together and clobbered the enemy and, you know, might have broken their bones and had their bone marrow for supper. It kind of worked then. It works less well, and there's much less rationale for it now. We know that in spite of our complexity and the huge amount of difference that is engendered by epigenetics from the time we're in the womb. I mean, identical twins start becoming different in the womb. In spite of that, our DNA is essentially horrendously similar.
Yeah.
Race in genetic terms is meaningless.
Sure.
Meaningless. I mean, when you think of how much genome we share with mice, you start getting funny feeling. But these ways of thinking, which have been collectively called biases, but they're just ways the brain works. And the reason it works like that is to save time and energy and protect the body. And it's predictive. So that if someone who looks like a stranger walks through the door, I will clock that within maybe 300 milliseconds. Yeah. Just before my conscious mind can think about it, my emotions will have started kicking in.
You don't even know why you have a bias, but your brain, like your amygdala, has already kicked in and said, "Hey."
Yep. Say, just are telling you, be wary.
Sure.
And there's some absolutely fascinating stuff around that. Absolutely fascinating. For example, there's a hormone called oxytocin, and that hormone is excreted, for example, when women are pregnant and are preparing themselves for birth, mentally and physically. The body produces more oxytocin, and that is known as a bonding or the love hormone. People who are in love are bathed in it. Men have it as well when they become fathers.
Whenever I do a very hard workout, like I do Muay Thai, right? So I do Thai boxing. Whenever I do something unbelievably over the top intense, I come home, I am Mr. Lovey-dovey Cuddle, which is probably a wash in oxytocin. So
there's oxytocin, and it prepares you for bonding. It's also known as the trust hormone because high levels, if you trust someone, high levels of oxytocin are generated. You can actually generate trust by oxytocin spray during one of these games, etc., etc., etc. What's less well known is that works within your us group.
Okay.
You take someone from an out group, and oxytocin has the opposite effect.
Oh, wow.
And it's as physical as that. And that is where the third image may come in.
Okay. You're a master at this. It's great. I love it. Usually I'm just like, oh, let's go to the next image. Exactly. Let's move on to the next image. But you know what? I want to interrupt for a second because I'm going to flash a book. So the camera won't let you see it. Essentially, it's the book called Behave.
Yes, Sapolsky.
Yeah, Robert Sapolsky.
Behave. Yeah, the bit about oxytocin is in Sapolsky.
Exactly. And so the thing is, I actually asked him to be on the podcast. So maybe now, if he listens to it, he said he couldn't because he's writing a book. But now if he listens to this podcast...
Here's my absolute hero.
He's my hero. You can't have him as a hero. He's my hero.
I just loved that book.
Oh my goodness.
Absolutely loved that book.
Yeah.
I thought it was the best book I've ever read.
You learn a lot. But okay, let's move on to the next photo. And you know what? If I get him on the podcast, you two are going to meet as well. Okay, so
that would be fantastic.
So the next image is, if I can describe, do you want to describe it? It's you call it Robin.
Yeah.
Why don't you describe it?
There are two images together, and one of them has been deliberately faded out and has additional noise put on it, which is the same image, but it's made blurry. And the reason for putting those two together, I mean, ideally you'd want the blurred one first, and you ask people, what do you see in it?
Mm-hmm.
And it's possible to see a few lines, a few shapes. The most famous one, and these are called emerging images, is one of a Dalmatian in a woody surroundings with lots of dead leaves in quite sharp black and white, which normally you cannot see as a dog unless you've had the sharp version of that image first. So if you look at the two, if you look at the one which is a robin on a twig in Scotland, and then you look again at the blurry one, you see more of the robin.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the question is, why? What's going on? You are actually seeing exactly the same image. It's just as blurred as before. However, you now see more of it. It begins to have more meaning for you. Oh, that could be a bird on a twig. What's happened is your brain has an expectation, and it's filling in the dots.
Mm-hmm.
You remember as a child doing those drawings where you have to join the dots and see a picture, and sometimes they were obvious and sometimes they weren't. Well, that is one of the core functions of the brain. Use previous knowledge and experience to predict what you're going to see, hear, feel, touch, taste, do.
Mm-hmm.
Isn't that just absolutely mind-blowingly fabulous?
Yeah, it's
Can't sit in my chair and
I think we fall in the same part of the pool, I guess, whatever you want to call it. I also find it fascinating. I mentioned this before, but when in my early 20s, I was run over by a car and I had a severe brain injury. I was in a coma. I had 3 brain hemorrhages. I was paralyzed. And then I can't remember waking up. I had about a month of amnesia. And I can't remember any of that stuff. But what I can remember is my cognition building slowly but surely as the swelling in my brain was fading away. And so at first I couldn't read and I couldn't really speak very coherently. I couldn't stay awake or think for very long. And then one of the real dramatic moments was after the rehab center. I was living back again with my girlfriend at the time in our apartment, and we went to go see a movie. And for the first 5 minutes, I absolutely could not make sense of what was on the screen. My brain just saw light and shadow, and I was just like, what is this? And so she just like, oh, this blah blah blah, this actor is speaking to this. I could hear the thing, but I could not see it. And then it's like one of those illusions where all of a sudden, okay, now I can see it. So in my case, a very vivid experience of essentially that moment where your brain is filling things in and being excited like you are about what's actually happening.
That's a fantastic example. And people who have had strokes and need rehabilitation to be able to walk, talk, understand again, have similar experiences to yours, not perhaps as sudden, but they can relearn. Mm-hmm. And that's, that in a way, that's an interruption to the narrative, because a key point is to understand that the brain is constantly changing, constantly. Everything that we experience, that changes our brain in some way, because the brain will either reinforce a connection, start losing a connection, make a new connection, just perhaps tie in some connections that weren't tied in before, all the time. Now, children's brains do that more easily, faster, and there's more of it than adult brains. But adult brains don't stop growing, changing until either you have dementia or you die or you have some brain disease. So it is the brain constantly changing and learning. What we call learning is brain change. It can be body change as well.
So you're doing a PhD, you're committing to a PhD, which is going to be essentially a research experience.
Yeah.
So where, of all of the questions that you could be asking, what is the one question that you've sharpened on or you've landed on that's impelling you to do this?
It comes from two strands of work. One on mindsets by Carol S. Dweck of Stanford and colleagues of hers and people who have worked. There's a woman called Alia Crum who also works in this field. And that is how Carol Dweck has worked for years. And again, she's one of my absolute heroes. Changing mindset of young people, children at school and essentially college students, from a fixed mindset, which is essentially I am who I am and I can't change myself, to a growth mindset, which is if I work on this, I can make some kind of difference. And by essentially teaching children that they can change their brains in an appropriate way, and in what I would think of in therapy terms or in training terms and coaching terms, using relatively straightforward, I wouldn't say simple because there's a huge amount of research behind them, a huge amount of work for what works. But essentially that change makes a difference to how they perceive themselves, their persistence, their resilience, and their exam result. So they do better, they are more persistent, and they're more resilient. They deal with failure better with a growth mindset. Now, again, that's the kind of thing that makes me want to blow horns and wave flags and so on, but I won't, because I'll move on to the second thread, and that is the placebo effect.
Interesting.
Most people know of the placebo as something which is used to test medical information, pills, operations, procedures, treatments. You test whatever it is against the placebo, which is essentially inert. If it's a pill, it's a sugar pill. It doesn't have any drug in it, anything that's likely to change anything. If it's a drink, it could be disguised water. One of the most famous placebo experiments is where they did knee operations and they tested them with fake knee operations, was essentially just causing a scar in the skin.
Oh, wow.
And the fake operations worked at least as well as the real one.
Wow.
In some cases, I hasten to add, and I'm not going into the detail of that, but it's worth looking up. So the placebo effect has been studied in medicine and has been used in medicine for many, 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 many years. What is beginning to emerge now, and what I like to try, is to bring that mindset change and the placebo effect together. Not for young people, because young people don't have as much feedback from their lives and experience that set them in their ways as adults. And to see whether I can get more sustained behavior change. And by behavior, I always mean cognitive as well as physical behavior. So ways of thought.
So go ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
The placebo, if I can just give you one example, which I love, so I'm going to force it on you.
Go for it.
Which is an experiment that Alia Crum, who I mentioned earlier, who is also now at Stanford, I believe, conducted. And I call it the milkshake experiment because it was an experiment with milkshakes. So she gave people two groups, two different kinds of milkshake. They were told that they were exactly the same level of calories, whatever milkshake calorie level is, say 600 calories for the sake of argument. And one group was, that's the standard. One group was told that milkshake had 1,000 calories, for example, and the other group was told that milkshake had 215 calories. In other words, it was below the level of being any kind of over-the-top food that you might eat. The people who had the 900 calorie, for the sake of argument, milkshake, produce less of a hormone called ghrelin. And ghrelin is the hormone that tells your brain whether you're hungry or not.
Right.
Than those who had exactly the same milkshake, but were told differently.
Yeah.
So now, experiment with placebo effect. Now that actually had an intervention, which was a drink. Mm-hmm. But the reason for the change was not the drink itself. It was what you were told about the drink.
Yeah.
So that is a purely psychological. They are looking now, not that one. That one had a physical element. But the placebo effect is now being looked at, not just as giving of pills or a fake or a drink
sugar pill,
or a fake operation or whatever, but as a purely psychological,
that's interesting,
communicational intervention.
I love the idea of giving a listener a few ideas of how they themselves can take it up to another level or do some kind of change in their own lives, right? Because we don't, so for example, just listening to us, we can't predict which sentence is going to hook in some listener's brain, and yet it might inspire a whole cascade of new ideas that influences them for such positive change. So not as a researcher and not as an academic person, but as a coach and as a mentor to somebody, is there a bit of advice you could give on how a person could harness this idea of positive placebo for themselves to create some kind of change?
I wouldn't talk about positive placebo. What I would say, I would remind people, I guess, that everyone has a superpower. And that superpower is being able to direct your attention. Now, not every living organism can do that. Some organisms are just responsive to stimuli that comes in from the outside. So if they feel warmth, they might go towards it. If they feel cold, they might go away from it. If they sense food, they will go towards it. If they sense a predator, they will go away from it. And that's a responsive kind of attention. That is their bodies and what they have as a brain working together to preserve them for survival and as we were saying earlier, and not just survival, but survival in a good state. Mm-hmm. Humans and maybe some of the higher animals are able to direct their attention. In other words, your prefrontal cortex, the executive part of your brain, can direct your attention. And what is attention? Attention is a mechanism through which the resources of the brain, the physical resources, are directed at dealing with something.
Yeah.
Okay? So when you decided to go and deal with the dog that was barking, you were stimulated by the barking. That brought your attention to it. Mm-hmm. If I had been a super speaker, you might not have heard the dog talk.
Don't sell yourself short. That's a very annoying dog.
Because it's your dog. Because it's your dog, and it's almost like your baby. If your baby is crying, you're going to pay attention to that no matter what.
Right.
But we all know you can be totally absorbed in doing something, in reading or listening to music or doing something you love, creating something, making something. Someone could walk into the room, talk to you, and you literally will not hear what they say. Now, that is not because your ear isn't taking the sound in. It is because your brain isn't processing it.
Right.
And that is because attention is a double-edged sword. Attention not only focuses the resources, but because those resources are limited, it takes them away from other stuff. So when women are pregnant and they are told that during labor they can practice a technique, when I was pregnant and was going into labor, called effleurage, which is essentially just stroking gently your belly to take your mind away from the beginnings of the contraction. We are talking about mechanisms for shifting attention to something you want to pay attention.
Right.
And away from something you would rather not pay attention. And for me, that power is a superpower.
It's fascinating.
And most people don't really know they've got it. They kind of know. But in order for it to work really well, like anything, you have to practice. Right. So my one piece of advice would be practice paying attention to what you want to pay attention to.
That's great.
For example, so much of self-help advice is about exactly that. You know, people say, write a list of all the good things that happened today. What does that force you to do? It forces you to pay attention to the good things rather than bad things. You do it often enough, it becomes a habit.
Sure.
Just like if you focus on all the nasty things that happen, all the people who pushed you when you were in the supermarket queue or line, trying to buy your toilet paper or your groceries, and you feel, what am I, invisible? You could meditate on that, and that would make you miserable, but you don't have to. So that would be, for me, practice paying attention. Yes, you can practice it. No, it isn't easy.
But it's a skill.
It's sort of, yes. It is a skill which you've got and you can use, and you do use all the time, but to get it fully under your control, practice.
What I didn't know, this is what we're going to be talking about. Because I saw the images and I wasn't really sure where you're going to go with it. I kind of knew a little bit of where your world tends to be in, but I found this to be really interesting. Obviously, with the work I do with Po, which is very much about helping people themselves become better service leaders. I really appreciate this. You're taking the time and meeting with me and explaining this. This is really interesting work.
I did a TEDx a few years ago on the power of attention, which
I'll put the link
useful.
I'll put the link in for sure.
Yeah, and it's been fun. I mean, I kind of thought, certainly from our email communications, that there were enough common interests to make it a good dialogue.
Thank you so much for joining me, Randall Fancy, for this episode of Shooting It Raw. I really appreciate it. If you want to learn more about the show in general or today's guest in particular, be sure to check out the episode notes at www.shootingitraw.com. That's shooting-it-raw.com. I appreciate everyone who takes some time out of their day to give Shooting It Raw a listen. So get out there, make amazing photos, and be sure to appreciate how amazing the world is. Gratitude and a sense of humor